Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have you join us on this current installation of our Coffee Break webinar. If you are in higher ed, or more specifically in the grant funding space, the past 6 months have been quite dizzying. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of unknowns, and essentially a lot of uncertainty. And what has been encouraging of what has emerged from that time is that there's been a lot of people checking in with each other and having various conversations about how they've been doing. And I'm no exception. People have been very gracious and they reach out and they ask, how are you doing? How is your team doing? And I usually respond by saying something along the lines of, well, we're controlling our controllables. And from there, the conversation goes on in a kind of predictable direction. But one time I was having this conversation, and when I said we're controlling our controllables, someone said something very interesting back. And what he said was, it sounds like you're giving your team stability within instability. And I asked him, well, tell me more about this perspective. And he gave me this analogy of a ballerina. He says, when you think about how a ballerina spins, what a ballerina does is that they pull in at their core and they create a spot to be able to focus on. And that's how they create stability and instability. And so, in thinking about that analogy and thinking about what's been going on in our context, we wanted to frame the APR process as creating stability, controlling your controllables by focusing on your story and transforming that annual progress report into a strategic tool. So, during our time together, really what we want to be able to do is be able to take something that is really overwhelming, and sometimes you kind of push away from that whole process, but trying to really condense the entire APR process into something that is very manageable. So the first thing that we want to do to be able to do that is to really focus on the APR's purpose and the components. Next, we want to be able to provide you with a short-term and long-term strategy for being able to complete the APR. And of course, as always, we want to be able to make sure that we're answering your questions. So before kind of jumping into the materials, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. So we're with the Rux Group, and since 2008, we've been the partner of choice for those navigating complex systems in education, workforce, and innovation. And through our service offering of program evaluation, we have worked with hundreds of teams on maximizing impact and sharing that story through their annual report. And I'm Lana Rux. I am the president and CEO of the Rux Group, and joining me is Elise Hope. So let me turn things over to her for her to be able to share her role on this webinar today. So Elise?
Thanks, Lana. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to have you all join us for today's webinar. Again, my name is Elise Hopes, and I'm the Business Development Manager with the Rux Group. And for today's webinar, I'll be helping with the Q&A portions that are sprinkled throughout our session. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you should have both functions, a Q&A function as well as a chat function. Feel free to use the chat function if you want to hear feedback from others who are joining the webinar today. And then you can use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you may have that we'll address during those Q&A segments. I should note that it takes just a bit of a moment for those questions to come through on our end. So if we don't get to your question at that segment, we'll try to get to it at the next. And any unanswered questions by the end of the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up in email. So I think that's all I have, Lana. I'll turn things back over to you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much. So we have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. And as I noted at the opening, you're going to hear me really try to emphasize certain points by saying there's only 3 points of this and 4 points of that. And again, we're really trying to distill items to their core to make something that's otherwise very overwhelming much more manageable. So let's start with the purpose and components. So there are really only 3 kind of objectives or overall purpose for the APR. The first one relates to accountability. So this piece is really focused on overall high-level components of what within the grant is actually being achieved. The second piece is focused on learning and adaptability. So if you're in the grant space for any length of time, you know that grants do not live in the vacuum, they live in the real world, and that your project is also existing in the real world. And so what you proposed may not always actually uh, realize in terms of practice in the real world. So, how are you learning? How are you adapting to what's occurring? And then the final piece is really in regards to what are you going to do next? What's coming up? What's on deck? And what's really nice is that when you think about the APR and thinking about just various different funding sources as well, what they're asking you within that APR really maps onto these three objectives or these purposes. So what they ask you usually in the APR is going to be something around what did you say you were going to do? And so in this question, they say, what did you propose? What's in your proposal? Or what did you say in the previous APR? And then they're going to ask questions that are related to what happened and why. So, what are your accomplishments, challenges, and changes? So, what are you learning and how are you adapting? And then finally, there's going to be questions about so, what are you going to be doing in the upcoming year? What are the next steps? What are the course corrections? So let me walk through a couple of examples, pulling out just portions of an APR to try to highlight how these three questions may actually emerge. So let's first look at the National Science Foundation. So some of the questions that will be asked of you from the National Science Foundation will be what are your major projects of the major goals of the project? What was being accomplished under these goals, in terms of your activities, your opportunities, and then also then what are your next steps? So if you look at the major goals, again, what did you say you were going to do, that first piece? And then what did you do? What happened? What did you learn? And then that final piece is in regards to those next steps. A similar pattern also emerges when we start looking at the Department of Education. So we look at their APR and you're asked to talk about what changes do you want to make? Are there going to be changes in the next year? And sometimes those changes are to the activities, and sometimes those changes will be to the budget itself. Then there are questions that are related to your partnerships. Is this a cooperative agreement or not? Those are all things that are really settled during the proposal phase. So, what did you say you were going, what did you propose or say you were going to do? Then what happened is the last piece. And the last piece of what's asked on this page. I should say, just for NSF and for DOE, the Department of Education, in both examples, I'm just really pulling out a page from the APR to really highlight how those questions map onto, excuse me, how those components of the APR map onto the questions that map onto that overall objective. And then finally, for individuals who are in the philanthropic space, very similar type of pattern also happens as well. When you're asking about the activities, what have you done? When you're asking about what your proposed work, what happened, and then what are you doing in terms of the next steps. So that just gives you kind of an overall kind of flavor about how those questions really help in terms of thinking about condensing down what you need to be able to put into your APR. So let me take a moment here and pause and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we do have a question in queue. Can you share more about what it takes to shift our mindsets from treating reporting as more than just a compliance tool and as a strategic tool?
Okay, it's interesting because one of the if you come to the webinars often enough, you'll start seeing where I'm very often talking about mindset because mindset plays such an important role in everything that we're doing, particularly in the grant space. These grants are things that we all hold very near and dear to us. We really want them to do well. And how we approach that and the mindset that we take is really important to be able to either approach the work or if we're pulling away from the work. So I think one of the things that helps in terms of the mindset is one, in terms of the type of culture that you create within your team. um, Reminding yourselves to reframe things. To reframe things as learning, that you're constantly learning. And I think that's one of the benefits of APRs, having that learning and adaptability question, is that it helps you to make sure you're focusing on the learning, and you're learning and you're trying and you're experimenting to see what's working and what's not working. So I think that that's one of the things that you need to do. And something that we say at the Rux Group often is that you also just need to give yourself some grace. I worked with someone who was on the team. She's since retired, and she used to kind of joke and say that writing a proposal was like writing fiction. And we know it really isn't writing fiction. But her point was, there's so many theoretical parts of writing a proposal, so many things that you don't know, black swans that can actually happen, that you really have to learn how to adjust. So you have to give yourself a lot of mercy within that process. So I'm not sure if there's another question or not, but let me go through a bit more information and we can return to those questions if need be as well. So, uh, thank you for that great question. And so now let's going to turn our attention to the strategy. Now that we're clear about what's being asked, now let's kind of focus in on what's the strategy that you can use in terms of approaching the APR. And this strategy I like to call the right around the corner strategy. It's your short-term strategy. I have been in this grant space working with projects and teams for almost 2 decades, and I know that not always that APRs are not always completed in ideal situations. So I want to give some context or some perspective around how do you do this when that date kind of got here sooner than you expected, you were really busy, and how can you approach writing the APR? So one piece to keep in mind, whether it's the short-term strategy or the long-term strategy, is that there's really only 4 phases to writing an APR. Again, as I said, I'm trying to just condense everything down to make it a lot easier to be able to complete the work. So the first phase is on data gathering, and that's when you're pulling all the information that's related to the grant. The second phase is in regards to your own kind of individual reflections that are related to the grant. So you're looking at the materials, you're kind of resurrecting your memories of what happened over the last year, and just really pulling together your initial thoughts on where the project is. And then the third phase is when you pull the team together, whether it be a team of 2 people, 3 people, or a much larger team, and you start engaging in sense making. You start reviewing the questions from the APR, you start talking about the project in a much more kind of intentional way about what happened, understanding what occurred, and thinking about what are the appropriate next steps, as well as just acknowledging where there are gaps in the data. And then that final stage is actually writing that APR. So organizing the notes from the previous phase to really be able to create a draft of the APR and have it edited and receive feedback on it. So let's say that for this kind of short-term strategy, that you only have a month, that you don't have a lot of time to be able to pull things together. How should you spend your time? I think for the short-term strategy, what we would suggest is that you're really going to focus in your time equally on each phases. So about a week on data gathering, individual reflection, sense making, and then the writing component. Now, some people may say, well, it's a month. I only have a month to write this. I really want to focus in on the writing piece. Why would I spend time on the data gathering on these other phases if I only have a month to be able to pull things together? Here's the reality. The first part is you're going to have to engage in all these phases anyways. So at some point, if you go to the writing piece, you're going to have to pull the data together. You're going to have some type of reflection and try to have some type of sense making. Two, if you focus in on the writing first without intentionally beginning the other steps, that's where it starts to become very overwhelming. You start looking at that APR to start answering the questions, and you realize, I don't know where the data are around that. I don't have the information on that. And it becomes very overwhelming in that process. And so I think that's one reason why people pull back from writing the APR, just because it seems very overwhelming to be able to do. And then finally, really the hard part of the writing piece is really thinking about what you're going to say. So if you have this intentional focus for a couple of weeks beforehand on the reflections, on sense making, you will already start having some thoughts and some notes on what should be included in the writing process. So it will help that writing component. Something else that I just want to share about the writing piece, and this is kind of my thinking and what I've seen in terms of writing APRs or even writing the evaluation report as well. So if you're around me for any length of time, one of the things that you will often hear me say is that research is very similar to evaluation. There's a lot of things that are very similar in that process. You have a hypothesis, a theory of change in the evaluation and research. You both have questions. You're both testing your hypothesis or your theory of change. You analyze your findings, refine that theory of change in evaluation or within your project and your initiative. And when you're research, you refine that as well. And then there's knowledge sharing with research. And then there's some knowledge sharing too within program evaluation that can be shared more broadly, but definitely there's summarizing a summation of the findings. But I would say that it seems to me in APR evaluation, this grant space, that summation is less like a research article and more like building a legal case. So when you think about it in research, a lot of times you're trying to really find that kind of smoking gun in terms of the evidence, the piece of evidence or the couple of pieces of evidence that really supports your hypothesis. In evaluation or in APRs, what you're doing is you're pulling data together for preponderance of the evidence. So you're pulling things together in a way to try to make the case much more like in a legal case of why your project is making the impact that it's making. So I want to just share that in terms of thinking about how you pull the data together, how you pull information together is really important because you're making that legal case. Um, Something else in talking about evaluation, I should say too, is that your evaluation report, if you're working with an evaluator, really should help in terms of the service of the APR. Even though an evaluation report is generally an internal document, a lot of times working with the evaluator is really helping you with your data systems and helping with your sense making in that entire process. And so if you think about your evaluation report and then your APR, one of the key resources can be that evaluation report and working with the external evaluator. You just want to work together to be able to make sure that that's timed correctly so that the evaluator has enough time to really make sure that they've captured data for that time frame and that you can use it to be able to include the information in your APR. So let me pause there to see if there are any questions.
We do have a couple of questions. The first is, who are the individuals that you would recommend to be involved in the reflection and sense-making phases?
Yes. I think so. I'm gonna um, respond to this first on the conceptual level and then talk about it from an operationalized level. So, what do I mean by the conceptual level? So, first, who are the keepers of knowledge of your project and the initiative? Who are supposed to be the key partners? So those could be, of course, if there's the PI, the co-PI, a project manager, if there are faculty members, whomever are really involved within that initiative that really have some piece of the puzzle or may have some perspective. I've seen where some schools and some projects are actually able to bring in their budget people as well, because the budget is a piece of that puzzle too. So when we think about what I was saying about this is a legal case, all your evidence should be pointing in the same direction in terms of what case that you're making, and your budget is an important piece of that. So if you've said that you've had a lot of activities and your budget isn't reflected in terms of the spend down with the activities, you need to kind of talk about that. Or if there are kind of challenges that you're experiencing when you talk about your next steps, you really should be able to share that information out. So budget people, or other individuals, and if you're working with an evaluator, definitely your evaluator may have some perspective on that too. We've been in a part of many, and I've been a part of many conversations, and sometimes we have information on the project that the project team has just forgotten about. So really trying to get that system on the project in the room, right? I think we may have time for one more question, if there's another one.
Yes. Can you recommend a tool to use with the team to engage them in the sense-making phase before meeting together to synthesize as a team?
Yes. So I think one of the things, and we'll get to some of this when we talk about the long-term strategy, is that you really want to start early in the project. You really want to start thinking about the systems that you put in place. And some of these systems can be really simple. They can be like a data workbook where you're looking at the APR very early within the life of the project, what information is being asked of you, and creating that workbook, and then having someone who's responsible for gathering that information. If that's not working with an evaluator, then someone on the team, like the project manager, or someone who's responsible for making sure that information's actually populated. So you can do that really early within the life of the project. Some really interesting things that our team's been doing is really creating, and you can create like dashboards off of that. And we know you can create dashboards from quantitative data, but our team's really been doing some interesting things too, creating dashboards off of qualitative data as well. So there's some things in terms of using AI that we've been able to do to be able to make sure that we have a real good dashboard that we can look at for qualitative data as well as quantitative data. But a lot of those conversations should happen really early within the life of the project. And I think that that question actually feeds very well into the next segment. So let me jump into that real quickly. So we talked about the just around the corner strategy, and I call this long-term strategy. Let's not do that again. Because sometimes when you put that APR together real quickly, it's not the most enjoyable process. So, what can be done so you don't have to go through that process again for the next year? So we talked about in the last segment about having 1 month to pull things together. So let's say that now you're at the beginning of the grant process and you have a whole year to think about the APR and really think about the arc of what you're going to report at the end of that year. So you may want to spend, overall about a third of your time on data gathering. So at that upfront, really making sure that you have the tools in place to be able to collect data, and you're doing that on a much more ongoing basis. What you'll see, probably the individual reflection time may actually decrease, but your sense making time as a group may increase and the proportion of the time on your writing may decrease as well. So these time frames aren't written in stone, they're guidance. And the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of this stuff is much more iterative. It's really woven into your overall process. And so the burden of writing the APR at the end is going to feel very differently because you won't have to have that same kind of targeted amount of time dedicated to gathering data and the sense making. You would have been doing that through the entire year. So what are some things that else that makes it that you'll be doing differently? As I said again, it's the same for processes, but with data gathering, that will be collected on the ongoing basis, and you have had systems in place to be able to gather that information, and you'll have the related documents more closely accessible and at hand. You'll be doing those individual reflections on a periodic basis so that information is readily available. And then also that sense making is going to be much more built into the process. So you'll have regularly scheduled meetings, and you may have a targeted quarter focus on, okay, let's make sense of what's going on in the project and just think about things at a higher level. And then making sure you're documenting all of that throughout the year, so that you have those learnings so that you can make sure that that's included within your APR. So I'll pause there for a final question. Our time has gone by so fast. So is there
Mhm.
another question for us or for me?
Yes, there is. How do we handle reporting on challenges without undermining our progress?
Um, Without undermining your progress. And maybe I'm going to infer from that question that part of that is, you know, kind of the concern that will someone see the challenges in a negative light? Will the um, program officer, the funder, the organization see those challenges in a negative light? I think one, everyone expects there to be some challenges. I don't think that challenges are not the problem. The problem with challenges is not quickly responding to challenges. It's letting challenges sit for too long. So, in terms of reporting on those, I don't think that impacts on the perception of the project at all. What you want to do, and I think this goes back to mindsets, you want to understand that this is all learning and that having challenges is to be expected. You just want to be able to respond quickly. And if you have a regular meeting cadence and you honor that cadence, even if it seems like you don't have something to talk about, you can more rapidly respond. And I think that actually tells a great story. I think that's a great movie that you had challenges and you overcame those challenges. So there's always a positive way of kind of being able to look at that. So we, believe it or not, have a couple of minutes left. So I do want to go through a couple of additional items real quickly. And if there are more questions, I will make sure to follow up either before I end or follow up at the after the webinar. But I will say, a couple of resources. So one resource, because we've been talking about mindset, and I kind of joke in almost every webinar, I in some way touch on mindset. But I think if you want to really have a really great overview of mindset, go back to our last webinar. I'm mastering grant implementation, the art and science of project resilience and success. Also, I should say too, the Rux group is here available to you to help with portions of whatever you're maybe struggling with or kind of grappling with within your projects. So from helping with data foundations, building the data system, facilitation of the sense making process, reporting, refinement, and review, as well as helping to actually craft that story as well. And then also, I should say, our next webinar is going to be on working in partnerships and working with partnerships, particularly industry partnerships. And I will be joined with Dr. Mary Slowinski, who's done a lot of work in this area. So really excited to have that. So let me kind of summarize what we've gone over today. A couple of things. There are three purposes of the annual reporting, and that corresponds to basically the core elements of the annual report document. 4 phases of the annual reporting process remain consistent. What changes, whether you have a long-term or short-term strategy, is how much time you spend in each phase. And think of the reporting of the APR evaluation less as an academic research and more like a legal brief. And you assemble data to really build your case and tell your story. And then finally, embedding the 4 phases of the APR process into the work throughout the year will make next year's APR writing a bit easier. So let me leave you with this final thought. The universe is made of stories and not of atoms. So when you control the story of your project, you control a lot. I know you all are doing really great and amazing things, so go out and tell your story. Until next time, thanks everyone.